to Galatia, and he preaches the gospel. And as he preaches the gospel, he preaches to Celtic tribes who eventually get the gospel as far as Spain in Galicia, France, which is Gaul, and to the Gaelic people of Scotland and Ireland. And all four of those eventually, which started out with a small remnant of Christians, had great revivals in history. St. Vincent in the 4th century in Spain. Patrick also in Ireland, leading the whole island to Christ. And then there was the Gaelics of Scotland under John Knox's ministry, and the Huguenots of France, which led so many people to Christ, and they were all wiped out and murdered. But they were a great shining light for the gospel. And before the Galatians became used by God to spread the gospel to places where God would do great things, they were invaded by these people we call Judaizers. The Judaizers were people that get mad at the gospel. And after Paul, when he preached in Galatia, and they even threw rocks at him, and he went into a coma, and then he came back out all beat up, and he went back and set up the churches and preached again. He started these 4 churches, which might have spread to more. And 1 year later, instead of attacking the people, the Judaizers, and the reason they use that word Judaizers is because they wanted them to follow Jewish law. They got into the churches, and the first thing they did is they made all the men in the church prove that they were circumcised, and if they weren't, they were taking them to circumcise men in the church that were not Jews, and then telling them they had to follow Jewish laws. Well, Paul, when he got word of this, he reacted immediately, and he wrote the letter to Galatians. And in this, he really got into it. It was Paul about the gospel, and he mentions just in these first, in just a small amount of time, we'll read it here, about the gospel. He talked about grace versus the Jewish religion to be saved. Because they were not telling people, well, it's just a good thing if you follow Jewish stuff. They said you have to do it to be saved. And one can practice Messianic Judaism. That's practice Jewish traditions as a Christian. And Messianic Jews are Jews who have accepted Jesus as the Messiah in unity with Gentiles, both saved, not by works, not by the law, not by circumcision, but by faith in Jesus alone. Living by faith in God's promise rather than keeping Moses' law. And we're going to see in Galatians 2, 1 through 10, Paul continues his case to talk about that, saying, it is the gospel that saves you, not the law. And the gospel he preached, he's made it clear, is the only acceptable one. In fact, he said, you preach any other gospel with this, he called down double curses on anybody that would preach another gospel. And the noun, and it's interesting the words he used, there was a noun gospel and a verb, which we put it as gospelize. Usually it's translated preach or preach the gospel. But there's a whole different word in Greek for preach, caruso. And the word for preach the gospel literally says gospelize in Greek. But most English translations just translated it into preach or preach the gospel. And it appears in Galatians chapter 1, verses 6 through chapter 2, verse 10, 11 times in 29 verses. The math would say that gospel or gospelize appears in every 2.6 verses. We can safely say that's the theme. No chance of error on that one. But also in chapter 2, 1 through 10, he mentions Titus, the uncircumcised, who was walking among the top-level circumcised Christian leaders and was completely accepted. And then he talked about remembering the poor, because if you follow the timeline of Paul, this was at the time when Paul went to Jerusalem to take money for the Christians in Jerusalem who were starving. And he made sure that he collected a huge offering for them. So the issues are, he mentions Titus 2 times. He mentions his apostleship 2 times. It's really cool stuff about what an apostle does. He mentions the gospel 4 times in chapter 2, 1 through 10. He mentions his words seem to be influential and seem to be pillars. This seem to word he mentions 4 times. And then he mentions circumcised, circumcision, uncircumcised, uncircumcision, Gentile 8 times. That's a big deal in 10 verses. That becomes a theme also in these 10 verses. An ethnic, anatomical operation mentioned 8 times in 10 verses. And I'm not going to make any jokes in this one, but it does appear once every 1.25 verses. So we can call this section from Galatians 1 and then chapter 2, 1 through 10, the gospel in Paul. Paul, the apostle of God, because he made it clear, my being an apostle is an act of God, not because somebody approved of me. With the only gospel that comes from God, he said, my message is not of any origin other than that of God. And he says, however, it has been confirmed by the seem-to-be pillar apostles. And then he says, to the church today, and to our church today, I believe that it behooves us to stay true to the gospel. So, let's go ahead and take a look at the text and a little commentary on the text, but this is going to go quickly. So, first of all, then after 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas. In other words, Paul had gone home to Tarsus after he caused the problem in Jerusalem, right after he got saved. And then Barnabas took him to Antioch in Acts 11:25. He said, taking Titus along with me. Titus is one of his early friends. We don't know how he met him or how he got into Paul's life, but he was one of Paul's early companions. It was a trip to deliver an offering for famine relief, Acts 11:30. Then he says, I went up because of a revelation. There was a prophecy at that time. And the prophets, including one named Agabus, who would eventually give another prophecy to Paul about him going in prison. And this Agabus and the prophets said, there is going to be a huge economic crisis in the Holy Land. And so they took that prophecy seriously, took up a huge offering, and delivered it to them. And that was a revelation from God that caused him to do this trip. And then it said, and set before them, though privately, before those who, and he uses the word, seemed influential. In other words, we're going to find out why he seems to keep using this word, seem to be. And not everything has to be public. They're talking about this privately. And difficult and conflict situations often require leadership coming together to first deal with it. And then he says, the gospel that I proclaim among the Gentiles. You see, it's the same gospel as for the Jews, but delivered with different methods. We saw that when he was preaching in Galatia. Galatian Antioch, he preached in a synagogue, and he talked about the history of Israel in Acts 13 through 53. And when he was preaching to the Celtic pagans in Lystra, he talked about God giving them their crops, God's role in their celebrations and in their agriculture and taking care of them in the natural world. And so same gospel, but all about Jesus. It's all about repenting of sin. It's all about accepting the Lord Jesus Christ as Lord. But you go a different approach depending on who you're preaching it to. And then he goes to say, in order to make sure I was not running or had run in vain. So he's saying, look, I don't want to have this us preaching separate gospels. We're going to confirm that we're on the same page, that those apostles of Jesus and me an apostle of Jesus, but my apostleship wasn't as one of the original 12. I was chosen afterwards, and so they dealt with that. And then he goes on to say, but even Titus, who was with me, was not forced to be circumcised, though he was a Greek. So these guys took Titus in their fellowship, understanding he was a Gentile, and they didn't require circumcision, even though the Judaizers in Galatia were telling the people in the church, you don't get circumcised, you're not saved. So he's telling the church in Galatia, hey, we're up here with the apostles, Titus is uncircumcised, and they didn't make him get circumcised, and you know he's saved. Then he goes to say, in order to make sure, yet because of false brothers secretly brought in, who slipped in to spy out. Think about this. Who would do that? Who cares that these people have their faith that they practice? Why would you send spies? And first of all, you send people in to try and circumcise the Gentiles in the church. And then you send spies to spy on them? Why would you do that? I'll just make it very clear. The gospel, if you understand it, will do one of two things. It will make you mad, or it will bring you to give your life to Jesus Christ. It will make you free. And if you as a Christian, as I as a Christian have many times, struggle with things and are not walking in freedom, it's because we haven't really internalized the gospel. Everything that Jesus really did for us. But if you're an unbeliever, when you understand the gospel, it is so powerful that you, to reject it, understand how serious the call of this gospel is. It will make you angry, or it will make you free, or you just don't understand it yet. And that's what happens throughout Paul's ministry. God blessed his ability to deliver the gospel in such a way that people understood it and got mad, or they got free. And I pray that the Lord does the same through us and with us as we share the gospel in the world that we live in. So they're spying on these guys to find out what's going on here. Religious espionage, to spy on our freedom that we have in Christ Jesus. Some people hate freedom so much they'll do anything to try and stop it, so that they might bring us into slavery. Why would you want to do that? What is this big deal? Why are they trying to give people spiritual slavery? Why can't they mind their own business? The gospel has that kind of effect on people. When it's understood and preached, it makes bad people really bad. And it transforms people who believe it. And usually when there's a lot of going on in the middle, where nobody's getting really mad and nobody's really getting set free, it's because we're not understanding the gospel for what it really is. And so this is what's going on here. And from those who seem to be influential, once again he uses this word seem to be, and he goes, what they were makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality. And isn't it interesting, even today, there's certain people that if this pastor says something, then that's got to be true. But if, a regular old pastor says something, it's no big deal. And there's nothing that any pastor just gets our goats, when you're the pastor of a small church and you've been saying something, and then somebody will come up and say, yeah, I heard so-and-so on the radio say this. That's amazing that he said that. I'm like, I've been saying that to you for 2 years. And so, those, I say, who seemed influential added nothing to me. So he just seems to keep beating this drum about seem to be. And then he goes on to say, and he made it clear that his authority had nothing to do with those guys that came from God. But then he goes to verse 7. On the contrary, when they saw that I had been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been entrusted with the gospel to the circumcised, for he who worked through Peter for his apostolic ministry to the circumcised, worked also through me for mine to the Gentiles. Notice he only mentioned him and Peter, not the other guys. And the point that he's making is, that's where he's using the seem to be. Peter did have a genuine call to Jewish people. Now that caused some problems, but he did. And Paul had a genuine call to the Gentiles. And part of an apostolic ministry, and it still goes on today, not with the same capital A apostolic like it did then, is that God gives certain people a clear responsibility over a certain geographical area, over a certain type of people, over a certain nationality, or over a certain kind of a subculture or subgroup. And in those areas, those people have a unique authority from God. Very interesting. Paul called to the Gentiles. He still preached to the Jews, But all he ever did to the Jews was make them mad. They didn't seem to really respond to him. But then he goes to the Gentiles and he's planted thousands of churches and changed European history and world history and Western civilization. Any historian worth his salt will tell you really started with the Apostle Paul, bringing the gospel in a whole new way of thinking to the Western world. And so there is a real thing about this apostolic ministry, but guess what? It doesn't just apply to apostles or strong Christian leaders. Every one of you has a pond that you can fish for Jesus. There are people that God has given you. If you're a parent, your kids. There are people, and you need to ask God, what is my calling? Who am I called to for the gospel of Jesus Christ? And hear what he has to say to you, because he cares about people coming to Jesus, and he wants you to be his instrument to do so. And if you ask him, he will help you see that, and then be able to find out how you can respond to bring the gospel to those people that he cares about and he wants you to care about. So then, going to verse 8, he says, for he who worked through Peter for his apostolic ministry, the circumcision. Okay, we got verse 8. Verse 9. And when James and Cephas and John, who seemed to be pillars, fourth time that word seemed to be comes out, and now I'm going to tell you why I think it's my opinion. And I have to tell you, I agree with it. I agree with my opinion. Okay? It's his way of saying, first of all, my authority is equal to them. But it also is saying that they're on shaky ground with their staying in Jerusalem and only ministering to Jewish people. You see, they are shaky ground thinking they're not called to the nations, that they're only called to Jews. And this was a big problem. But what did Jesus tell his disciples in Matthew 28:18 through 20? Go therefore and make disciples of only Jews, instead of all the nations. Then why were they stuck in Jerusalem only there? And it didn't start changing until finally James, John's brother, got his head cut off. And then all of a sudden they start, ooh, we better get out of here. Then Peter gets put in prison. They were going to cut Peter's head off, except an angel came in and saved him. And then they started spreading around. But also, they had a little bit of a growth when Philip, and it was never the apostles that started it. Philip took the gospel to the Samaritans in Acts 8. So it was only after Philip did it, none of the apostles did it, that the apostles came and backed him up. And so that we had this little thing with the Samaritans, and then now they go back to Jerusalem and just do their thing with Jews. And now all of a sudden Antioch happens, and all these Gentiles get saved in Antioch. So does Peter go to Antioch to disciple him? Does John go to Antioch to disciple him? Does James go to Antioch to disciple him? Does any of the apostles go to Antioch? No, they sent Barnabas. When Jesus told them to make disciples, and the word ethnoi for nations is also the word for Gentiles. In Greek, it's the same word. And in Hebrew, it's goyim, same word. They were disregarding the command of the Lord. And so Paul's saying they seemed to be big shots, but they weren't even doing what Jesus told them to do. And here's my question. Church of Jesus Christ, look on that wall over there. Can we please dedicate ourselves to the gospel of Jesus Christ reaching this world? Can we become really missions-minded as a church to understand that this matters to Jesus? So anyway, that's my opinion. So it says, those who seemed to be pillars perceived the grace that was given to me. And let me just point this out when he said that. God's authority, even for someone like Paul, who was a high achiever, is only given by God's kindness, not a person's worthiness. And then he says, they gave the right hand of fellowship to Barnabas and me. They recognized their call. They said, okay, guys, go for it. But that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. Interesting, though, all these guys, except Peter, ended up going to other nations. God eventually had his way with them. In fact, Thomas goes to India. And I lived in the city where Thomas was martyred. The spot is marked. When, you know, it's so weird how Jesus prepared him. Remember when Thomas said, you know, how do we know the way? Jesus said, I am the way, truth, and life. He said it to Thomas. Well, guess what is the one message that will get you killed in India? They had, my friend Raj used to tell me, Eric, I come from the land of 350 million goats. The only way you can get Indians mad is say there's only one way. And when Thomas goes, he told me there's only one way, and I felt his hands at his side, and he rose from the dead, so he knows what he's talking about. And as he started the church in India, and he was preaching the gospel of the resurrection of Christ, a Brahmin priest came up from behind him and drove a spear through him. And that spot where he died is still marked today, and the church that he started is still there. So they ended up going to the nations eventually. And so then he goes, so it's interesting though, in those days, the way they divided up the missionary of the gospel was not about skin color, was not about geography, it wasn't about culture, it wasn't about the language, you know, which are usually when you're a missionary, you think about these different issues. I spoke to a missionary yesterday, and we talked about getting training for the culture and language he's going to work on. They made their divide based upon an anatomical operation. Okay, we go to the guys that are this way. I'll go to the guys that are this way. So, hey, it's in the Bible, folks. I'm not just trying to mess with this stuff, you know. Only they asked us to remember the poor, the very thing I was eager to do, and that's what they did. It was on that trip to Jerusalem that Paul and Barnabas took the money to help the poor Christians that had been depleted their finances. First of all, when the church started in Jerusalem, there was thousands of people. Who do you think was hosting people in their homes? The Jerusalem Christians were hosting people. So that took a lot of their resources, and then came an economic disaster, a famine, and they were just completely out of funds. And so they went and did that. So now we want to do a recap of chapter 1. Oops, sorry. Stay true to the gospel. This PowerPoint has been acting really weird, so let's not worry about it. But the recap of chapter 1 is Paul's dispute with the Judaizers was not a difference of opinion, but a line in the sand. It was a non-negotiable gospel. His case in Galatians 1:1 through 2:10 is that his gospel is the only one. He didn't get his gospel from the other apostles, nor did he need their okay, yet they were in complete agreement. So chapter 1:1, Paul said, Paul an apostle, not from men, nor through man, but through Jesus Christ and Father God. 1:6, he said, you Galatians are turning to a different gospel. And that word turning is very interesting. It's the same word that you would use for making a transfer, filling out a transfer request. You're changing your gospel, and you can't do that. And then 1:7, there is not another. But Judaizers want to distort the Christ's gospel. Very interesting. That word for distort would almost be like pretzelizing, taking and twisting, like you would be making a pretzel. And verse 1:8, but even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel beside the one we preach, let him be accursed. And he says it twice. In 1:8 and 1:9, he calls down double curses on anybody who would preach a gospel beside. And that word beside doesn't mean a different gospel in the sense that it's a different message. It even means that if you preach the gospel, then add something to it. Which is what they were doing. Beside the gospel was, but you also have to get circumcised and follow the law of Moses. Okay, you can do this Jesus thing if you want, but you better get circumcised and follow the law of Moses, you're not saved. And there are people who will tell you, you know, Jesus, they'll believe in the Trinity. They'll tell you that Jesus died for your sins. They'll tell you different things, but then they'll take something beside the gospel and say, but you also have to do this in order to be saved. If that's the case, they have gone too far. And Paul would call curses on them. And then 1:11, the gospel preached by me is not man's gospel. And again, he's making that clear. I am doing this as a servant of Christ. And he said that in 1:10. And he said, I did not receive it from any man in 1:12, nor was I taught it, but received it through revelation of Jesus Christ. Jesus gave me the gospel. That's for all you Bible nerds, if you go to Hebrews 2:3, the author of Hebrews kind of refers to the fact that he got the gospel from other people. So that's why I would say, I don't think Paul's the author of Hebrews. Because Paul says, my gospel didn't come from anybody, just Jesus. In 1:13, he talked about his former life in Judaism, and that he was, excelling in Judaism. He was called himself a Hebrew of Hebrews. And guess what? That didn't matter. 1:15, he set me apart before I was born and called me by his grace. Wow. If you know Jesus, hey, when you were a fetus, he was already talking to you. You may not have understood it yet fully, but he already called you as a fetus. And he called you by grace. There's nothing you did or nothing you are that makes him want you, except that he is a loving Savior. And then he goes on to say, he was pleased to reveal his Son in me in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles. When God is working in our life, he wants to reveal Jesus in us instead of us in us. And when he reveals Jesus in us, then we can share him with other people. And that word preach him among the Gentiles in Greek is that I might gospelize him among the Gentiles. It's the word gospel as a verb. 1:17, after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas, which is one of Peter's 3 names we know in the Bible, and remained within 15 days. So he had a couple of weeks with Peter. Actually, the word Kepher comes from Cephas. So anybody who likes Kiefer Sutherland, anybody named Kiefer, that word comes from that. So Peter gets 3 names in the Bible. He's Simon, he's Peter, and he's Cephas. 1:18, I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. And then, so he had this little intimate, quiet visit with Peter and James, but he actually went out into the public and preached Jesus all over Jerusalem. They wanted to kill him. People got mad, and he had to run away. And it says, after Paul left, the church enjoyed peace. Paul did have something about him that caused agitation. And then verse 120, chapter 123, they were hearing it said, he who used to persecute us is now preaching the faith he tried to destroy. Now, we want to take a look now at the timeline of Paul is world history. So stay true to the gospel. And if you take a look at it, it's hard to kind of see it, but we kind of did it there. It's like a jigsaw puzzle, and you got to spend some time on it, putting together all the events of Paul's life and the timeline, but it makes sense. And we need to know who this guy Paul is as we continue on in this book of Galatians, because to understand what's going on with Paul makes the book of Galatians really clear as we go further and further into it. First of all, number 1 on the left there, his revelation of Jesus when he got saved. It was either AD 31 through 33 in Acts 19. He saw the light. We sang that, I saw the light. Paul saw the light. He was revealed who Jesus is on the Damascus road. Number 2, he was saved in Damascus, and the Lord described his future ministry in Acts chapter 9, verses 9 through 19. In fact, Jesus told the guy that baptized him, Ananias, he said, I'm going to show him how much he has to suffer for my sake. Really interesting. And then we have number 3, he escaped to Arabia for 3 years. We talked about those 3 years in Arabia. We even have a whole message on Paul's time in the desert. We don't know all the details, but we do know that these desert experiences for men of God tend to be pretty significant. Often people have their tangible spirituality in the desert, and that's where demons hang out. But we also know that his time in Arabia, he might have also preached in that area in the Decapolis as well, because Paul had a hard time not preaching, so he might have had both. And then his Jerusalem visit with Peter and James, who represented the apostles, but he didn't visit with the church. They only heard about him, and he preached in the city without having checked out with the church, and they wanted to kill him. Now, it's very interesting. This was Paul's early days. He had not yet really connected in how he's supposed to relate to the church. And then eventually he became a great church planter. So the church became a big part of everything he did. And then 5, he was in Cilicia and Syria after he caused a big problem in Jerusalem. He went back to Antioch, Cilicia, and when he was in Antioch, they wanted to kill him again, and so he had to sneak over the wall. No, that was the first time. This was a different one. He ran off to, after he got done getting, people wanted to kill him in Jerusalem, he went back home to his mom and dad in Cilicia, in Tarsus. Hung out there, and then Barnabas said, you know, this guy needs to be serving somewhere. So Barnabas came and got him and brought him back to Syria in Antioch. And then he was back into Jerusalem after 14 years, AD 45 through 47. He was 14 years with Barnabas. And so a lot going on there. And so Cilicia and Syria, Acts 9:30 and 11:25. And then we have his back to Jerusalem, Acts 11:30, number 6, the right hand of fellowship and call to the Gentiles, Galatians 2:7 through 9. And that's interesting, though, is that he had already been determined to go to the Gentiles. In Acts 11, we see that Paul is saying that. Before he declared it, if you remember in Acts 13, he shook the dust off his feet after he preached in the synagogue and said, I'm going to Gentiles! That wasn't when he made the decision. That had already been determined. That's when he declared it. And then finally, in 8, he had his missionary journey with Barnabas, AD 46 and 47, where he preached in the island of Cyprus, and then went to the Celtic people in Galatia. And then after his missionary journey, he returned to Antioch in Syria, and he wrote the book of Galatians from there when he found out that the churches that started in Galatia were leaving the gospel for a different gospel, or a gospel that was beside their gospel, and he got hot under the collar, and he said, so quickly! So right after he's returning, about less than a year, he starts writing that letter. And so these are the events of Paul's life. And so I'd like to just go from there and just kind of read to you this Paul that we need to understand. Reflections of a driven apostle. They call me Paul, I once was Saul. I need to plan for my week. I follow Jesus, I have a kingdom to seek. And everything I do, there are people to reach. Woe is me if the gospel I don't preach. So in my busy week of work, should I plant another church? Also write a loving letter to help a church do things better? I know things will be getting rougher, and that I am called to suffer. It's not news when I'm beaten and bruised, homeless, starved, or cold that I choose for the way I'll grow old. And yes, there's that thorn in my flesh. Because I've been so often jailed, some think that I've really failed. Some say my life is a miserable case, but so sufficient is his grace. Carried on by Jesus, my hero, I'm going to gospelize Caesar Nero. It's not so awful to be an apostle. And when I'm dead after losing my head, things will become very sweet, because that's when I'm going to meet the one who showered me with grace, eye to eye, face to face. And now another rhyming summary of Galatians 2, 1 through 10. 14 years time flies. Paul had Titus fraternize and socialize with Jewish guys. Surprise! Came the spies. To Judaize in Christian disguise, to hypnotize, memorize, overemphasize Galatians with Jewish law. But Paul, so wise, no compromise to old Jewish ties, gave them goodbyes, stood against their lies. Not too nice, wouldn't legitimize that a Gentile circumcised, yes, scandalized those Paul gospelized, evangelized, and baptized. Time to realize only the gospel from the skies identifies a follower of Jesus Christ. Conclusion, staying true to the gospel, sharing the gospel. Like Paul, we set history, we alter history here on earth, and even more so in heaven. God bless you. Have a great week.
Amen.